Before we begin, I just want to state that I understand the statement Ben Shapiro doesn't understand fascism probably gets a, well, duh, out of quite a few people. Some more news to the video back in 2022 discussing two articles Shapiro had wrote on fascism at the time, where Cody Johnston explained in detail why they were utter nonsense. Similarly, Ben Shapiro not knowing what fascism is was a point made during the infamous 2019 interview he had with BBC journalist Andrew Neil, which led to the following exchange.
Again, it was your description of the State of the Union address in 2012 as fascist.
The wording of President Trump's 2012 address was bad and wrong.
That's all. There are plenty of things that are bad and wrong, but it doesn't make them fascist.
Well, I suppose that's true.
Okay, first off, this was in reference to something Shapiro said about the 2010 State of the Union, not 2012, and also it was President Obama, not President Trump. But as for that definition, to paraphrase some more news, great definition, Ben, or should I say unfascistic definition. But I decided to read the article being talked about here, and Shapiro's definition of fascism makes about as much sense as it does in the video I'm covering today. President Obama's State of the Union address was the greatest American rhetorical embrace of fascist trope, just the one apparently, since the days of Woodrow Wilson. I am not suggesting Obama is a Nazi. He isn't. I am not suggesting that he is a jackbooted thug. He isn't. Even if we could be forgiven for mistaking Rahm Emanuel for one. Oh, it wouldn't be the first time you made a mistake regarding Rahm Emanuel, would it be, Ben? President Obama is, however, a man who embodies all the personal characteristics of a fascist leader, right down to the arrogant, chin-up head tilt he utilizes when waiting for applause. He sees democracy as a filthy process that can be cured only by the centralized power of bureaucrats. He sees his presidency as a Hegelian synthesis, marking the end of political conflict. He sees himself as embodiment of the collective will. No president should speak in these terms, not in a representative republic. Yes, the president in a representative republic is not supposed to see himself as representative of the people's will, even though his entire job is to represent the American people who put him in office in the first place. You know, I think I see why Ben thinks everyone's being called a fascist constantly. He watches that Simpsons episode, Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, sees this clip.
Okay, this should make my bosses very happy.
Your bosses?
Yep, all 250 million of them.
And thinks they're calling Bush a fascist. It all makes sense. Well, okay, it makes sense if you ignore the fact that fascists actually hate democracy, and as such they wouldn't view the will of the people as a good source for determining which actions are correct, with Benito Mussolini himself even once directly saying, "The struggle between the two worlds, fascism and democracy, can permit no compromises. The new cycle, which begins with the 9th year of the fascist regime, places the alternative in even greater relief. Either way, we or they, either their ideas or ours, either our state or theirs." This from the person who Ben calls the most historically important fascist.
Historically, the most important fascist was actually not Hitler, but Benito Mussolini.
Obama does it habitually. If that sounded like a bunch of gibberish, that's because that's what it was. Shapiro called Obama fascist because of his head movements, I think, put together with him seeing himself as the end of all political conflict, which isn't inherently fascistic. How exactly is political conflict supposed to be ended? Is it through us compromising and reaching mutually beneficial conclusions? Because if so, that's just representative democracy. It would be pointless to discuss at length the dictatorial, demagogic nature of much of Obama's address, the attacks on the banking system, the unprecedented personal assault on the Supreme Court justices, the dictatorial demands, "I want the jobs bill on my desk without delay," the scornful looks, and high-handed put-downs directed at his political opponents, it would be even more pointless to discuss the incomprehensible stupidity of Obama's policy proposals. Export more of our goods? Why didn't anyone else think of that? Okay, let's just go down that list real quick. Attacks on the banking system aren't dictatorial or demagogic inherently. What do you mean by unprecedented personal assault on the Supreme Court justices? Because actually checking Obama's speech, the only reference I could find to the Supreme Court was this.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests, or worse, by foreign entities. They should be decided by the American people. And I'd urge Democrats and Republicans to pass a bill that helps correct some of these problems.
He didn't openly ignore a Supreme Court ruling like President Andrew Jackson did. He didn't attempt to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court arrested like Abraham Lincoln did. He didn't expand the number of Supreme Court justices just so they could rehear and reverse a previous decision that he disagreed with, like President Ulysses S. Grant did. He didn't show support for rallies which existed to argue that Supreme Court decisions were incorrect, like Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush did. The first one of which became the first president to publish a book while in the White House specifically on the topic of something the Supreme Court had declared a constitutional right. He just said he disagreed with a decision. Shapiro gives no other examples, and also I have no idea what his issue with Obama's proposal here is. Does he think it's stupid, or does he think it's too obvious? Because it can't be both. Shapiro defended this column several years after the fact, by the way, in an article that specifically existed for the purpose of him admitting his mistakes. Yes, there's like 3 different sections in this article, which is supposed to be him talking about dumb things he did, where he explains how right he is to do those things. Calling certain political activities and perspectives fascist. I've done that a number of times. So, for example, the left doesn't like that I called President Obama philosophically fascist. Tough. In my view, Obama saw the government as a big make-people-do-things machine. You could say he thought the purpose of government was to govern the people it was in charge of or something. I explicitly stated I am not suggesting Obama is a Nazi. He isn't. I am not suggesting he is a jackbooted thug. He isn't. I put it this way, and then there's a quote I already read out. I've also described as philosophically fascist attempts to force bakers to bake cakes, attempts by companies to root out and destroy those who disagree, and universities banning mainstream speakers. And, by the way, I've also described Trump's economic central planning as fascist as well. So, there's that. Yeah, and that article was nonsensical as well because you didn't really even make a case there. You just asserted it without any explanation or evidence. Even if one agrees with the notion that Donald Trump is a fascist, that needs an explanation in order for the point to be valid. Otherwise, you're just stating something, like Ben does in the article he linked. I also want to point out this column has the problem of accusing hypocrisy without actually demonstrating hypocrisy. Shapiro shows a bunch of quotes of conservatives during the Obama administration criticizing crony capitalism, which is what he's actually referring to when he says fascism, by the way. With the implication, I guess, being these same people support it now, but he doesn't actually demonstrate that. And he was later even forced to update the article with an acknowledgement that one of the people he listed, that being former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, actually did later criticize exactly what Trump was doing. Also, one of the people he lists as flip-flopping on this topic, again without providing evidence, is Ann Coulter. I find that funny because Ben's probably sitting there wondering, yeah, why isn't Ann Coulter taking a stand against fascism? Maybe because she said things like this? My libertarian friends are probably going to get a little upset, but I think that's because they never appreciate the benefits of local fascism. Also, and this is not the most important part of all of this, I know, but I have to highlight this part of the column. The hypocrisy is of the highest order, and it's evidence that a soul suck has already taken place inside the Republican Party. Yes, other presidents have engaged in this sort of economic tyranny. Those presidents include Republicans like George W. Bush, but conservatives opposed Bush's steel tariffs, and they certainly didn't castigate other conservatives for opposing them or whitewash protectionism. We'll see whether conservatives begin to grow a spine now that Hillary Clinton is out of the way, but the early evidence isn't particularly promising. Ben, you specifically mentioned tariffs, but historically Republicans have been in favor of tariffs and Democrats have been in favor of free trade, albeit that dichotomy isn't as one-to-one today as it used to be, and in fact in many ways it tends to be the other way around. This is right below him defending calling Rahm Emanuel a capo, by the way. Now, I already took a bit of a shot at what happened regarding Shapiro and Emanuel. However, let's allow the man himself to explain what happened. In a 2010 column, I described White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel as a capo, a Jew who helped Nazis target Jews during the Holocaust. My basis for that statement was a Jerusalem Post report that Emanuel had told members of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee that, quote, thwarting Iran's nuclear program is conditional on progress in peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Jeffrey Goldberg, the Obama administration's appointed stooge? Do you have any evidence for that? I also want to point out, Goldberg is a citizen of Israel, and Emanuel held citizenship in Israel for almost 20 years. Both Goldberg and Emanuel have even worked for the IDF previously, denied the account on the Obama administration's behalf. Goldberg admitted that if Emanuel had said it, quote, that would be blackmail. Nonetheless, the Obama administration moved full scale towards promoting Iran's regional terror ambitions with Emanuel's help. The capo language was too charged, but Emanuel's participation in the Obama administration's pro-Iran agenda was despicable. Here's a column from 2003 where Shapiro calls PETA Nazis because of their, admittedly rather bad taste, Holocaust on Your Plate campaign. Human life and animal life are not comparable. While cruelty towards animals is reprehensible and damnable, it is certainly not on par with genocide. Only a Nazi could equate the two. The Nazis equated Jews with animals. In its Holocaust on Your Plate exhibit, PETA picks up where the Nazis left off. I also wish to point out this column includes this absolutely bizarre line of logic. PETA has no problem using Jews for purposes of its own, but stands by silently when Jews are murdered in Israel. Only after the Palestinians detonated bombs strapped to a donkey did PETA complain. PETA President Ingrid Newkirk immediately fired off a letter to Yasser Arafat. Quote, if you have the opportunity, will you please add to your burdens my request that you appeal to those who listen to you to leave the animals out of this conflict? Newkirk pleaded. When asked by the Washington Post if she, quote, considered asking Arafat to persuade those who listened to him to stop blowing up people as well as animals, Newkirk flatly answered, quote, it's not my business to inject myself into human wars. I pressed Butler on this point. Why does PETA have so little regard for Jews in Israel, yet feel no qualms about using Jewish Holocaust victims to forward its cause? His answer, as an organization, our mandate is to speak up whenever animals are abused and whenever animals are caught in the crossfire. However, he continued, we care deeply about all beings, regardless of species. How reassuring. Yeah, Ben, I wonder why the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals aren't talking about something that has nothing to do with their main cause? Why would you expect them to even mention something like the Israel-Palestine conflict? That's not something they exist to discuss, so assuming they would take a stance on it doesn't make any sense. I should also note that the next column Shapiro wrote at the time was one discussing Pat Buchanan and the American Conservative, and fair is fair, it's not actually bad or anything. I don't agree with everything in it, but it is far from horrible. However, what I find worth pointing out isn't so much what he said in it and more what he didn't say in it. You see, Shapiro never called Buchanan a Nazi, despite calling PETA Nazis the previous week. The reason I find this worth pointing out is because if PETA are Nazis, then Buchanan definitely deserves that label. It was Buchanan who was largely responsible for President Reagan visiting the Bitburg Cemetery in Germany, for example, a place where Nazi SS troops were buried, to quote Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in their article on Buchanan. He was also largely responsible for creating the line that those SS troops buried at the cemetery were, quote, victims just as surely as the victims in the concentration camps. There was also that time in 1977 when he wrote a column praising Hitler, and that time he wrote a column saying diesel engines do not emit enough carbon monoxide to kill anybody while defending a man against claims of being a Nazi concentration camp guard that was run in a newsletter that has openly denied the Holocaust. Now, Shapiro doesn't agree with any of that. However, if he felt so comfortable calling PETA Nazis, I can't help but wonder why exactly he didn't give Buchanan the same label the following week. Here's Shapiro calling Chelsea Handler a fascist for some reason. Here's him calling the United Nations a bunch of fascists for some reason. I really don't get the connection here. Okay, but now time to cover the actual video this commentary was supposed to be on. Is fascism right-wing? Facts, Episode 3.
The one thing everybody seems to know is that fascism is like Hitler, and this means the chief characteristic of fascism is the Holocaust. Therefore, by the transitive property, everyone you don't like is fascist, every fascist is Hitler, the most Hitler thing is the Holocaust. So, Donald Trump, or Ron DeSantis, or whomever the media say that day is probably going to commit a Holocaust.
And his evidence for that is non-existent. Look, I'm not saying that nobody has ever said that. There are 8 billion people on this planet. I'm sure somebody has made the specific claim Shapiro just mentioned. However, rhetorically, I think it would be smarter if he showed evidence to back up the notion this is a claim being made.
Invariably, the people in the media who use the word fascism use it to refer to a politician of the right.
Aren't you in the media? Because if so, then I just gave a whole bunch of examples of a person in the media, that being you, saying people on the left are fascists.
By American standards, fascism, which calls for unity of central authority and governmental control over private industry, among other agenda items, was far more left-wing than right-wing, which is why so many members of the American left were originally quite warm toward Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler.
How are you defining the left here exactly? Because this person Shapiro put up on screen is Catholic priest Charles Coughlin, a man who was incredibly important in the development of what later became right-wing talk radio, and who specifically found himself endorsing fascism because he viewed it as the only real alternative to communism.
First, fascism is characterized by a belief in the moral imperative of the centralized state.
Shapiro goes on to discuss people who did not consider themselves fascists, all of whom lived before the 20th century where the idea of fascism actually originated. He briefly discusses Plato, Rousseau, and Hegel, however, he makes no attempt to connect them with genuine fascists. He doesn't, for example, quote a well-known fascist saying these people were the basis for the ideology. Instead, he just asserts these people are relevant.
Second, fascism is characterized by a belief in nationalism, or, in its most virulent form, racial hierarchy.
He does the same thing here he just did. He discusses people, none of whom considered themselves to be fascist to my knowledge, and says their ideas were specifically related to fascism for reasons he fails to really explain or provide evidence for. He's just calling these concepts fascistic without any real evidence. And don't get me wrong, I'm not even inherently saying the things he's listing aren't fascistic, I'm just saying he's not arguing that effectively.
Third, fascism is militaristic.
Okay, this one is the best of the three so far in that it does actually discuss one fascist, that being Benito Mussolini. Although it does include a random tangent about how good the free market is.
That's the reason that we're able to create innovative products that are recognized and used the world over right here in America. We know how incompetent the government is. Imagine them actually controlling all private business. Things would look pretty bleak.
Other highlights include him discussing how Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy really took off with fascists.
There's a reason Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, was beloved of fascists.
Even though the reason why Nietzsche's work took off with Nazis was because his sister greatly edited them, so they would better fall in line with her Nazi ideology, not Nietzsche's. He also makes it a point to note that Marx's writings were not anti-fascist.
Mussolini was originally attracted to the work of Marx, which was not anti-fascist in any real way.
Which, I mean, I guess, given fascism didn't exist as an ideology yet, that doesn't really surprise me. However, Shapiro again offers no explanation for anything. The entirety of the third segment is essentially just waffling about how economic intervention in the economy equals fascism. And although he includes some quotes from Mussolini which conflate fascism and totalitarianism, the fact is, this still isn't really defined in any meaningful sense. He ends the video by saying that there are tons of aspects of fascism that we still have in the US today.
Everybody thinks of brown shirts and small mustaches when they invoke fascism, but there are a lot of aspects of fascism that survive in a variety of forms. Corporatism, government working hand in glove with industry, is a form of economic fascism. Racial hierarchies can be indicative of fascist thinking, particularly when combined with differential treatment under law. Militarism can be termed fascist, particularly when its resources are directed at domestic populations.
And then he goes on to say that we shouldn't use the term fascism or something.
Few people will admit to being fascist today. It'd be far more useful for everybody to simply critique policies with reference to history, but without reference to the buzzword that poisons everyday discourse. We can have good and interesting conversations about the value of corporatism, for example, without invoking Hitler. We can talk about opposing the shortcomings of atomistic individualism without invoking the Holocaust. The truth is that nowadays the term fascism tends to be a slur rather than a predicate to a useful conversation.
Without realizing the massive contradiction there, however, my final thoughts are essentially that he should take his own advice. Good night and good luck.